Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Patricia Salord, and I'll be your moderator for today. Our guest speaker is Leonard Hackel, Resource Associate at the Technical University of Berlin. Leonard Hackel will give you a presentation of the ConfigILM Python library, followed by an example use case and an outlook for the further development of the library. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box. They will be answered during the Q&A session right after the presentation. We would like to ask you to answer the survey that will be displayed after the online seminar. There are only a few questions that can be answered quickly. Now I will hand over to Peter Wagner, the project manager for EOLab at the German Space Agency, who will give you a brief overview of EOLab. Thank you.
So thanks, Patricia, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me. So I was going to just say a few words to EOLab and what it stands for. The EOLab clause is part of the strategy Artificial Intelligence of the German federal government. It provides German entities for science and development, hopefully easy and efficient access to Earth observation data, especially for AI methods, to use AI methods. And in this context, of course, I'm very glad to have Leonard with us, who will tell us about the ConfigILM library that has been developed as part of the AICube project on EOLab. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's see if I can start the presentation. I guess you can see the presentation now. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm going to present to you today the ConfigILM library, which is a library on configurable image language models. Specifically, I will be giving this webinar today in the context of visual question answering in remote sensing. I'm Leonard. I am from the Remote Sensing Image Analysis group at TU Berlin and the Big Data Analytics for Earth Observation group at Bifold, also in Berlin. Just very shortly about me, I did my master in computer engineering last year, and since then I'm a PhD candidate at the TU Berlin and Bifold. And my research interests are mainly remote sensing and big data analytics, as well as multimodal data processing, and all of that in the context of efficient deep learning. And all of these topics we will be touching today a little bit. The outline for this seminar today will be in detail as follows. We will have a short introduction about multimodal learning, specifically about VQA. Then I will give you an overview over the ConfigILM library and the motivations we have to develop this. And then we will go into an example use case, because I think understanding what the library does and why it does it this way is easiest if we have a look at an example. Then I will talk shortly about some upcoming works, and finally we will have a live demonstration on how the library works. Before I want to start with the library, just a few words to the project. The library was developed in the context of the AICube project. In this project, the idea is to combine language and data cubes. TU Berlin was mainly responsible for the deep learning part of the project, while our partners at the Jacobs University and the Rasterman Group were working with data cubes. If you have any interests in this project, please visit our project website on EOLab, or also ai-cube.be, where you can find details about this project. So let's start with ConfigILM. What is ConfigILM? ConfigILM is a Python library that is designed to support the development of image and language models. Right now, it is designed particularly to support visual question answering in remote sensing. Why do we want to do this? Well, visual question answering is a very intuitive way to interact with image data. And these ways to interact are very necessary because advances in satellite technology led to a rapidly growing number of data archives in remote sensing, and therefore we have a very high number of images. But to actually retrieve any useful information and very complex information that are contained in these images, we need intuitive ways to access. And VQA is one of the methods that enable very easy access to complex information. In VQA, the idea is that we have two inputs. First, we have an image. In our case, in remote sensing, that would be something like a satellite image. And then we have a natural language input. So for example, down here, we see an example, is there permanent crops present? And then we have a satellite image, and we have our VQA system. And we want to put in those two input data, and then we should retrieve an answer yes, which would mean that there are permanent crops in the given image present. And because we are using this natural language question, it should be very easy for any non-computer experts to also interface information in the images. You don't have to program anything. You can just ask your answer in a very natural way. And ConfigILM is specifically designed to help development of such systems. Usually, those systems are set up in a way that you have a dual encoder design. So you have some kind of encoder for images, and you have some kind of encoder for text. And the image encoder uses some kind of encoding to extract features from the image, and the same for the text encoder. And those features are then combined, and there is either a question, an answer generated or classified. In remote sensing right now, most of the tasks are using classification to make it a bit easier. And ConfigILM is supposed to make all of this designing of these models way easier by creating a single intuitive user interface. So everything that we have in these models has different dimensions usually, and combining those dimensions is very error prone, especially if you want to reproduce any results or you want to change minor details. And therefore, if a single intuitive interface is given to interface all these different parts of the model, it is very way easier to change parts of the model or reproduce results from other groups. And in detail, if we want to design anything with ConfigILM, we have to specify these key parts of the model, for example, which image model we want to use. In detail, we use something which is called an ILM configuration, which is part of the library. And everything which sets up the models is defined in the ILM configuration. Specifically, what we need to know, first of all, it's what type of network we want to use. So obviously, if we want to use VQA, we want to use a classification-based VQA model. But because we are interfacing with different image models, we could also use just image classification. The databases that we are using to create our models already contain weights. So if you want to use weights, let me formulate this differently. So the image encoders that are used are already pre-trained on ImageNet. However, ImageNet weights might have very different feature extraction than we have in our remote sensing data. So if you want to use remote sensing specific image extraction, you can also use image classification as a pre-training task. That's why we added a network type only for classification pre-training, so that remote sensing specific image features can be extracted as well. What you always have to define, independent of which network type you are choosing, is which image encoder you are using. For this, we are interfacing with the timm library. The timm library is a library for PyTorch image models. It contains a very vast selection of predefined architectures, CNNs and transformers. For example, we have ResNets and we have mobile nets, different CNN architectures. But there are also vision transformers. For example, the VIT base is contained here. And all of these are, as I said before, already pre-trained if you want to load pre-trained weights, or you could pre-train them yourself using image classification. In total, there are almost 1,000 image encoder architectures defined right now, but there are more to come, and there are also ways to define your own image encoder. If you want to use image language models, for example, in VQA, you also have to specify what your language part, so the text encoder, should be. And here we are interfacing the huggingface library. And here you can use some predefined models, for example, Bird model, which is a transformer-based text encoder, or Roberta, which also is based on the Bird model, but also more popular models, for example, GPT-2. And all of these models can be either used in their general form, as shown here, but also in a pre-trained form, for example, pre-trained on English text, but also in language-specific pre-training tasks. For example, you could use German pre-training or Spanish or any other language. And optionally, you can also define other parts of the model. For example, how many output classes you want to have, or any intermediate dimensions, if you want to use different fusion dimensions or a different fusion type. We can also see different examples of this later. However, unfortunately, today we don't have the time to go into very much detail on all these configuration parts. If you are interested in using this, there is a guideline documentation online on our GitHub. I will also have the link to the GitHub at a later stage. In this guide, you can see all the details of the interface and also explanations of what the different parts do, and also examples on how to work with them. And I guess the easiest way to understand how to work with them is using an example. And for this example, I will be using lightweight transformer-based VQA in remote sensing. This work was presented at IGAS of this year. And the motivation behind this is that right now, VQA methods, they mostly follow the design principle that I showed before with the dual encoder design and then some kind of fusion. However, usually there are very large encoders used, and we wanted to create a method that is not using such a high computational complexity and therefore also a very high parameter count, because those very large models are limited in their capabilities to be deployed in operational conditions, for example, on a laptop, or if they want to be used on a satellite. And therefore, we wanted to develop an architecture that is firstly smaller, so has fewer parameters, so that can be run on simpler GPUs or on a laptop, because it has lower computational requirements. And while it still has a very high VQA performance. And therefore, we designed an architecture which we call Lit4RSVQA. As you can see here, it is the same overall structure as we have seen before with the dual encoder design. We have an image encoder and we have a text encoder. We have a fusion and then we have a classification. And I will be going into a bit of detail in the following slides. Those details are more technical, but the main part that I want to show here is, even though the technical details are very different for different parts here, when we port this back into our library, it will be very easy to work with. So for the first part, I want to talk about image encoder. We decided to use different image encoder modules. The first one is based on an architecture called tiny. So this is a vision transformer-based architecture, which uses multi-head self-attention and feed-forward networks in the structure shown here. So we have always residual connections with multi-head attention in between and feed-forward networks with multi-head attention, and those blocks are then stacked. This is exactly the same architecture that is used in the standard vision transformer. However, tiny uses fewer heads and a smaller embedding dimension, which means that the overall architecture is way smaller, has a lower latency, fewer parameters, and therefore also a lower runtime when it comes to training and also inference later. The second encoder module we decided to use is called mobile with S. This one follows the design principle of a mobile net, but in the context of vision transformers. So it uses similar to mobile net blocks, it uses 2D convolutions and pointwise convolutions to extract local features. But it also uses multi-head self-attention and feed-forward networks, similar to the previous DITE architecture in transformer blocks to extract global features after extracting local features. This order helps to reduce the runtime complexity of the very expensive multi-head self-attention without having to reduce the number of heads. And finally, we are using Excite Nano. This one is a completely different architecture. It still follows the stacked encoder design of a vision transformer. However, it is not using the standard multi-head self-attention, but it uses reordering of matrix operations in a way where the attention is calculated between channels instead of between patches, as it is done in standard transformers, which they call cross-covariance attention. But because the attention is now only calculated between channels and not inside the channels, there's also something called the local patch interaction, which is basically just convolutions. And finally, for the text encoder, we decided to use tiny. This is the same architecture as BERT. If you have a look here, it looks very similar to what we had earlier with the DITE model. And that is because transformers can work with multiple modalities in a very similar way. And here we also have the same multi-head attention and feed-forward networks, but in a bit different order. And for tiny specifically, it is the exact same architecture, but with fewer layers, fewer heads, and a smaller embedding dimension, similar to the tiny we had earlier. And the training approach is a bit different here because for text data, there needs to be a very large and complex way to training. Either this or you have to use something called distillation, where a large model is trained first, and then a small model is trained on the same objectives, and then later with a training objective that is called distillation, where the larger model produces soft labels, and then the smaller model uses those soft labels to distill data into it. So that is basically like a fine-tuning step based on the large model then. So all of this sounds now very complicated, but what I want to show here is if we then have an implementation in a few steps of these different models, we can see that interchanging one or another encoder is very easy, even though the encoders might be completely different from each other, and the library does everything in the background. So the main takeaway from the last few slides for you is I want you to have is that encoders can be vastly different, but we can still work with them all the same. Before we can use these, however, we have to define some more things. So for example, here we want to define which fusion we want to use. We will use only a simple pointwise multiplication. That is a very easy fusion. However, it assumes that the output dimensions of both our modalities are exactly the same, because otherwise a pointwise multiplication would not work. And then as the classification module, we want to use a simple multi-layer perceptron. And this one assumes also that the output of our fusion module is exactly that of as the input as our multi-layer perceptron. And finally, as the classification, we just use the highest activation of our multi-layer perceptron. And there are some more things we have to define before we can start implementing this. Firstly, we have to define the dataset. So in the experiments we had in our publication, we used the RSVQA-XBEN dataset. This dataset is based on Big EarthNet, so it uses Sentinel-2 data. In the original publication of RSVQA-XBEN, that the dataset only had 3 bands, but we used an extended version based on the whole Big EarthNet that used 10 bands, which are all 10-meter bands of Sentinel-2 and 20-meter bands. The dataset here has a total of around 14 million image question-answer triplets and a total of 2 types of questions. So we can see some examples here on the right. We have these Sentinel images, and then we have 2 question types, land use, land cover questions, basically where the task is to classify these images and get which land cover classes are present. And then we have yes/no questions, where the question is if specific classes or class combinations are present, and only if this condition is true, then the answer should be yes, and otherwise it should be no. And finally, we have to define for some of the different modules some key parameters. For example, for our encoders, we want to set the output dimensions to 512, independent of what the original architecture had as an output dimension. And for the fusion, we want to have the hidden dimension as 256 for the multi-layer perceptron. And we will be evaluating all of this in terms of their overall accuracy, accuracy per question type, so for yes, no, and land use, land cover. And then also for the average accuracy, which is just the average of the accuracies per question type. And finally, because we want to check if our models actually are more efficient than models used before, we want to measure the parameter count as well as the floating point operations. And we will be evaluating in 2 scenarios where we will be using the 2 network types that we used before, that we mentioned before. So first, in the first scenario, we will be pre-training first with the classification network type on Big EarthNet, and then fine-tune on the RSVQA-XBEN dataset. And in the second scenario, we will only be using the RSVQA-XBEN dataset without any pre-training. And to compare our models, we compare with 2 baselines. One is VB Fusion, which is from the literature for remote sensing visual question answering. And the second one is using the same general architecture as we do. However, instead of using something like DITE Tiny efficient model, we use now DITE 3 base. So that is a larger transformer. And we implement this as well. So talking about implementation, all of this seemed very complicated to configure. However, if we actually use this now in the context of ILM configuration, we only have to specify very few things because everything else is defined, is specified in the background to make the different models work together. So as I said before, we have to define the image encoder module. So here we have the example for the mobile with S. And we have to define the text encoder module. And then we have some dataset specific parameters. For example, here we need to input which image size we want to use and how many channels we have, but also how many classes we have. And this is necessary because some datasets have a very large number of classes, others have a very small one. But in the end, our classification head has to be correct for the respective number of classes that we actually have in our dataset. For the fusion, we also have to specify some parameters. Here we specify 512 as the input dimension and 256 as the hidden dimension, as mentioned before. And the fusion method is multiplication. Technically, we don't have to specify all of this because there are also default values which are somewhat sensible set already in the background. But if you want to have specific values, you have to set them yourself. And finally, of course, we want to have a BQA classification as the task, and therefore we specify that we want to use this dual encoder design. So if we have all of this in our code now, the respective model will be created, and we can train on this. And if we train it, we have these results. As I said, we have two scenarios, one's with pre-training and one's without. Let's have a look in the results of the pre-training based ones first. We can see here at the top, we have our two baseline models, and then we have our efficient models below that. And we can see that the efficient models actually are performing very good, especially if we have a look into the land use, land cover column. We can see that the efficient models are performing very good in comparison to the baselines, especially the Excite Nano model is very performant, more than 3% better than the larger baseline and more than 13% better than the baseline from the literature. And this also is similar when we have a look into the non-pre-trained models. Unfortunately, there is no unpre-trained version of the baseline from the literature. But we can still compare it to the unpre-trained version of the larger baseline. And what we can see here is the performance of our small models is still very, very good. However, what's interesting is that the Excite Nano model, which was the best one before, is now the worst one. And actually, it is the only one that is performing worse than the VB Fusion baseline in terms of land use, land cover performance accuracy. And what we can see here is it's very important that it is easy to change between different training modes because you can have very vastly different results depending on which training approach you want to use and which encoders you use. So interchanging these different parts and having interchanging very easy can be beneficial for any type of research and any type of development. And lastly, in terms of efficiency, if we have a look here at the very right, we can see the parameter count in millions and the number of floating point operations in billions. We can see that our small models at the bottom, they are way smaller, almost 30 times smaller than the large baselines, something between 9 and 30 times. And the number of floating point operations, so how fast the models are actually running, is also way smaller, up to 600 times smaller. So all of this training was done using A100 GPUs on AOLab. So if you want to reproduce these results or want to change a bit and you have the idea of maybe something like a different fusion method or different dimensions could be very beneficial. Changing parts of the network should be very easy and could be done on AOLab because the GPUs on AOLab are enabling all of these calculations. So to conclude just this part of the seminar, the architecture we have here is very promising since it used fewer resources and therefore is easier to train and operate while still being very capable in terms of the performance compared to previous architectures. But again, I want to highlight here that the architecture is not limited to the considered lightweight models and can be easily extended or parts can be exchanged. And with the ConfigILM library, we can use almost 1,000 different image encoder modules and exchange parts. And also the text encoders, there are many thousand different variants online that can be exchanged. And of course, all the other parameters can be configured as well. If you want to have a look specifically at these implementations, our code is public on our Git of our group, or you could also have a look at our group website. There the code is also linked. So for now, we had this how we can design with ConfigILM. But if you want to change anything, because this user interface is just a single thing that we want to change, that we want to interface to change parts of the models, we want to interface also only this to modify existing architectures. And that is exactly what we will be doing next in the live demonstration. So let me just switch to the live demonstration. One second. Okay. So one short word about this live demonstration. The demonstration here is now not running on AOLab, even though in principle all of the codes here could be run on AOLab. However, right now there is the problem that to have something more visual, we are using Jupyter notebooks, and the reverse port forwarding for Jupyter notebooks somehow didn't work for me. So these codes are not running on AOLab right now, but if you copy out the codes into an external script and run this on AOLab, that should be no problem and run just as well as anywhere else. These codes in principle could also run on, for example, Google Colab. There are just some smaller caveats, and we are using not Google Colab today, just for using stronger GPUs than are available in Google Colab for free. So for this demonstration, we are using two different data sets. Specifically, we are using the RSVQA low resolution dataset, as well as a dataset called HRVQA. Those are not the ones that we used in the research paper, which we decided here to explicitly use something else to show you how interchangeable they are. So for this demonstration, I uploaded those two datasets to Google Drive as well. You can download them just over there via their official links as well. But because the datasets, especially the HRVQA dataset, is very large, I decided to only upload a subset of this dataset so that we don't have to wait forever to download these datasets now. I downloaded these datasets earlier already. If you want to follow this tutorial, you have to install GDown, which is just a downloader for Google Drive, where it downloads a zip file containing all the image in question, images and questions that we're using in this tutorial. So next, of course, you have to install ConfigILM. I already did this as well in before this tutorial. For Google Colab or AOLab, of course, this has to be once only. One remark here, ConfigILM is in its earlier stages of development. Therefore, the interface is not completely stable yet, which means there might be changes. If you're working with ConfigILM, I would suggest that you are specifying which version exactly you want to install to make sure that there are no large interface changes when a new update is pushed. Another remark here, if you are using Google Colab to reproduce this seminar notebook, you also have to deinstall Torch Audio because Torch is already pre-installed on Google Colab, and there is a conflict here because ConfigILM uses a very specific version of Torch, and that one is not compatible with the version that is right now installed on Google Colab. So then we can see if everything worked. If we import config-ILM and we look at the version, we can see which version is imported right now. 0.4.9 is the most recent version that is just published today. And that is the one we will be using for today. So next, we want to import some parts. Specifically for today, we want to import, of course, the ILM configurations as well as the ILM types to specify our configuration for our model. And we also want to import some parts which are specifically for the data loading. All data loading parts are in the config-ILM extra sub-library, which you don't have to use if you are using, for example, your own dataset. And all the datasets here are also in the distribution of the library already with some sample data. So what you can see here is we are also using something called resolve data dir, which helps us later when we want to use a dataset which we did not download before. So we can see here we include 3 data modules, specifically HRVQA and RSVQA low resolution. Those are the datasets that we downloaded just now. And then we also use RSVQA expand dataset, which is the dataset we used in our research. But you noticed that we did not download this, but we can still use it later because parts of this dataset are already distributed with the config-ILM library, and I will show you shortly how you can use these. In general, we will be using data modules here. That is just because we want to use PyTorch Lightning to make all this training a bit simpler to train on GPUs and so on. If you want to know specifics about PyTorch Lightning, I would suggest to look at the PyTorch Lightning website. Basically, we are wrapping a standard PyTorch model inside a PyTorch Lightning module. And all of this is just basically boilerplate code, which can be copied from any other PyTorch Lightning project. And the only thing that is specific here is that we are using the ILM configuration as an input parameter, and our model is based on the config-ILM model using this this ILM configuration. And whenever we want to do any forward passing, for example, in the training or in validation, we always just call this self.model here. And the same for validation and also for test. You notice that we only have a single parameter as input. That is because for our multi-model inputs, all the inputs are packed into a single list. So we only pass one input, which is already the image and the question packed as a list. So we can run this. And now we can go to the actual configuration of our model. So in this example, we want to use a ResNet 34, for example. We could use whatever model we want to use from the timm library here. We could use larger ResNets, any CNNs, any transformers that are defined in the timm library. And we want to use a BERT-based uncased. So this is just a larger BERT model with a lot more parameters, as we see later. And also some of the parameters that I mentioned before, we have to define here what is the number of channels we want to use, what is the image size, how many classes do we want to use. And we define all of these here, and then later we can use them when we do our data modules, and we can reuse them. As you can see here, we also have our pre-training flags set. So we will be using pre-trained timm models, so pre-trained on ImageNet and pre-trained Hugging Face models. So these are pre-trained on large text copy. This is a bit different than what we had in our example, but for now we are just using these to make our training a bit faster and show how we can load pre-trained models at all. If we run this, you can see here there are some warnings. Specifically, we set here a parameter called image size, which we need if we, for example, want to create a vision transformer. But for ResNet, the image size is not needed as an input parameter because ResNets don't need a specific image size. They can work with different sizes. So there is a warning put out if you set parameters that are actually not required by the networks. And then those parameters will be ignored, and it will be the creation of the model will be restarted. And if that is successful, just a warning will be put out and the model will be created anyways. And another thing that is put out here is based on the text model. So if the text model is loaded and already pre-trained, then a warning is also put out to indicate if you want to use not a standard text corpus. For example, if you're switching from just regular books, which most of the text models are pre-trained on, to remote sensing data, then a warning should be put out that you should probably fine-tune these text models to take into account that there is a distribution shift between your texts. Finally, we want to load our data. So here we load our RSVQA expand dataset, just RSVQA dataset, the low resolution version. And here we can just say we want to use the data directory that we have specified in the download above. And we also can specify what our image size should be, how many channels we want to use. There are some datasets, for example, RSVQA expand, which supports different configurations for channels. So based on the image size, the right configuration will be used. And because we are using image text models, we also have to define which tokenizers we want to use to convert the human readable text into computer readable text. And these tokenizers are, if we set a text model already in the configuration, then the tokenizers also already set inside the model. So we can just call from our PyTorch Lightning model, we can call the ConfigILM model and get the tokenizer from that one to make sure that the tokenizers actually fit. Because there are different kinds of tokenizers, we have to make sure that the tokens that are generated in the data module actually fit to what the model expects as an input. And finally, we have some more parameters, for example, the batch size for the training, and also something we call the maximum image index, which is just a restriction on how many images we want to use in this data module. This is just a quality of life feature of data modules we added to restrict how much data is loaded and how much is processed for faster prototyping. And because we also changed the number of classes, we pass this to the dataset directly to only load a specific number of classes. These classes are based on the distribution of answers. So if you have a dataset where the answers are not distributed equally, then this dataset, the training part of the dataset is evaluated and the number of occurrences for different classes is counted, and only the top n classes are chosen as possible answers for the training data. We will see in a later stage how this is handled. For HRVQA, we have something additional. So the original dataset, when it was published, did not contain a test split. So we added another quality of life improvement, which is the test splitting, where the validation split is split into a validation and a test split internally based on a random selection. The random selection can be controlled by setting a specific seed, and also how much of the validation split should be containing in the new validation split and how much should be contained in the new test split. If you don't want to use this splitting, there is also the possibility, first of all, to ignore this completely. Then there will be no test split. Or you could just use the test splitting seed repeat, which would mean that the test split is exactly the same as the validation split. And here as well, we set the number of classes and the maximum image index to restrict how much data we want to load in the end. So lastly, let's come to the last data set we want to use, which is RSVQA xpen. As you remember, we did not download this. However, because we are using the resolve data directory command, that one allows us to use actually mocking data. What is mocking data? Mocking data is a very small subset of the original data set. In our case, we decided to add 10 samples of every dataset that is supported inside the library itself, which is distributed automatically when you install the library. So whenever you are installing the library, there's already a very small subset of the dataset present on your computer. And if you just pass to the respective resolve data directory commands of the specific data modules, the flag allow mock, then it will try to resolve the data directory that you have as the first parameter. If it does not find the data set here, then it will use mock data, so this very small subset. And if you pass force mock, it will definitely use this mocking data, independent of if it finds a directory here that is valid or not. And because we downloaded nothing, we can just say here allow mock, and it will still be able to test out if our models would work with this data set. And everything else is exactly the same. And then we will also here have some warnings. If we use the resolve data directory, it will show us a warning that it couldn't find the directory provided, and that it is using the mocking data. So finally, we want to train our model. Oops. So let's start with the RSVQA low resolution training. We are using just a standard PyTorch Lightning trainer here, which allows us to not have all this code with the training loop and so on, because we have the PyTorch Lightning model defined earlier, which takes over all of these functionalities. And we can just load the data module and then call fit and test on it. So let's see how this works. So one thing we notice here right away is that we get a warning that there are fewer possible answers than requested. So we defined earlier that we want to have 50 classes, but it tells us here that only 9 classes were found in the data set. That is just a restriction of probably in this case that we said we want to have the max image index of 1000, and therefore it would find only 9 different classes. If we increase this, this probably would go away, this problem. We can also see here that the most frequent answers cover exactly 100% of the total answers, which is, of course, because we only have 9 answers, we are covering all the possible answers. But we can also see that, nevertheless, our training runs, including the validation and everything. For now, of course, the performance is not really good because we only have so few examples, but we can see that our training runs nonetheless. If we would now change this data set from RSVQA to HRVQA, we can run this again. And we can see here, in this case, we have more than 50 answers, which is why we don't have this warning anymore. And instead, it tells us that the 50 most frequent answers are covering 97.2% of the total answers, which means that the least frequent answers are not considered in our answer set. And it is still training anyways, and it changed everything in the background that we needed to change based on the different data that is input now. And it is running anyways. So we have to wait a little bit here because this data is a bit larger. Okay. That should be completed in maybe 10 seconds. And then we can continue with the last data set, which is the RSVQA expand data set, which is using the mocked data. And there we can then see again where it is using when it's using the mocked data, we will have some different outputs. So for example, here we had the total training samples of 1,000 and the total validation samples of 1,000, which was what we restricted it to. And then in the mock data, we can see that these numbers change. So here we again don't have the very good performance because we are only using a very small subset. And now let's change it to the last data set. Again, we have completely different characteristics here. And what we can see here is we only loaded 10 question answer pairs in the training set. And also for the validation, we only have 10 question answer pairs. And we also here have this warning that we wanted to have 50 classes, but only 2 were found. And it's only using those 2 classes now. But nevertheless, training runs the same. Because we only have 10 classes, we only have a single batch, and therefore the training is very fast. And PyTorch Lightning gives us some warnings here because we have fewer examples than a single batch. And the training is already complete. But we can see that even though we didn't download the whole data set, which has more than 100 gigabytes, we can still test out that everything works as we wanted to. And we can see that all the different steps, validation, training, and also testing works just as fine with the same data set, with the same model while changing the data set. Okay. So far to the live demonstration. Let's go back to presentation. So what's up next? If you want to work with this yourself, everything that we have as a release on our Git page will also get its own Zenodo link. So actually the Zenodo link is from yesterday. So that is version 0.4.8. But if you want to use one specific version and you want to also cite it to make sure that everyone knows which version you are using, you can use the Zenodo, which also has a DOI in it. If you want to use it, you can use pip, as I showed you just in the example. I guess the example will also be uploaded later to the AOLab GitLab. If you want to have the very most up-to-date information, please visit our GitHub, which we have here on the right side. Also, if you have any questions, if something is not working as you expected, or if you have any proposals what should be changed, if you have any features that should be added, please also always visit our GitHub page or write me an email. The email address will be shown shortly. And then we can figure something out to help you work with this library as successful as possible. And with this, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. If you are interested in other works of our group, please visit our group website, rsim.berlin. If you want to contact me, write me an email. And with this, thank you very much to the AOLab team and the Bundesministerium für Wirtschaft und Klimaschutz, which helped us a lot during this project and while developing the library, and also a very huge thank you to my colleagues, Begüm Demir and Kai Norman Klaassen, who helped me in the development of the library and also the related research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the amazing presentation. It was really, really interesting. And please do not hesitate to ask questions in the chat. And for everyone who is interested in the AICube project of TU Berlin, you can check the projects site on EULab for more information. Just a second, I will share the link with you in the chat box. So now you can see the link to the project site, and there are quite a number of different projects that were created on EULab. And by the way, if you're interested to share your projects and that you created on EULab as well, please do not hesitate to contact our support. And if you're interested in holding an online seminar for EULab, please also contact us. I can't see any questions yet. But I think your talk was so good that all questions possible were answered during the talk. And for all of you who don't know this service yet, there is also a user forum on EULab, and you can also use this user forum to discuss topics from EULab or topics discussed in online seminars on this user forum, or ask questions to the community of EULab and also CodeDE. So in case that no questions will come in, we will now share the survey, and if you have any questions afterward, please do not hesitate to contact Leonard Hackel, or if there are any questions related to EULab, please do not hesitate to contact our EULab support. We are always happy to help you.